Hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us at the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Competitive Advantage Talks presented by the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Jacob Harrison, and I'm a first-year MBA candidate at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce this presentation, Revving Up the Odds, Optimizing Man and Machine in NASCAR. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Matt Osborne, Laboratory Director of the Joe Gibbs Human Performance Institute, to the stage.
Thanks, Jacob. So today I'm going to do a quick clicker right here. Yeah, cool. Today I'm going to do a quick review of basically our research over the last decade into human performance optimization in NASCAR. For those that don't know us, Joe Gibbs Racing is Toyota's flagship North American motorsports partner. We field 4 cars in the Premier Series, the Cup Series, and 4 teams or cars in NASCAR's secondary series called the Xfinity Series. The story today is going to start basically in 2013. Again, for those that don't know, NASCAR has this sort of these big segments that are typically about a decade long that we call generations, that are often very different vehicle platforms and rules packages that we have to work within. 2013 was the start of the 6th generation of NASCAR, and it happened to be one of JGR's most successful seasons on record. We had 12 wins that season, and again, for context, that's about 1/3 of the total events. We unfortunately made the bad assumption that we could kind of coast in that generation because we were well prepared for the first season under that package with those rules. And we were humbled and hit in the face with our most unsuccessful season on record the following year. So this led to a deep discussion about how to build year-over-year competitive advantages, things that will last beyond single seasons. And really, our discussion at the time was focused in 2 planes. Vehicle data is not new to anyone in motorsport. There are mounds of it, but basically it is available to all of your competitors. At the time, there was no pit stop data or pit crew data available. So we decided to invest in that plane or in that domain because of the advantage you can get when you have access to information that your competitors do not. So I like to use Formula One as a nice comparison for why we invested in this space, because it feels like after their documentary series, everyone you meet is a new Formula One fan. So pit stops are relevant and impactful on the race outcome. But in NASCAR, if you want to think of it like a sort of a fraction, like the amount of time you spend pitting the car over the total race event, NASCAR's is much longer. Formula One is like 4 seconds over 2 hours. We are minutes in NASCAR, so it's much more impactful to the end race result. In addition, we have much fewer people performing those actions, so the task load per individual is way higher, and the movements are much more dynamic. Because no matter what form of motorsport you're in, you're changing tires, you're adding fuel, you're making adjustments to the vehicle. We have 5 people that do that, as opposed to 20 in NASCAR. So one of the first things we did in exploring how to optimize this performance on pit road was evaluate the equipment that our athletes were using. At the time, these were devices and things that you could get off the shelf. We spent a lot of time basically purpose designing and manufacturing equipment for our athletes that perform these pit stops with very specific purposes, i.e. going as fast as possible. You see a little clip here of a dynamometer we built to basically evaluate wheel guns, and again, among many other things. So in 2014, we brought out some of this equipment. This graph might be a little bit hard to read, but you can, the top x-axis where it's sort of 0 on y, you can think of that as the average time of the best pit crew, which happens to be Joe Gibbs Racing for all but one of these years. And then the light blue line was basically the difference to the next best team, and the blue line is the average of the field. So we bring this equipment to bear. You see we get this massive advantage immediately, but it diminishes very quickly because the scalability of sort of parts and pieces, once our competitors saw you needed to iterate on design, they went and did the same thing, brought it to bear, diminishing returns very quickly. In 2017, sort of anecdotally, what I'm going to tell you here today is that advantage that grows over time is our investment in human performance optimization, because investment in people, it just fundamentally is much more difficult to copy. So in 2015, we start collecting data. We had no domain expertise at the time in sort of movement mechanics or biomechanics, or obviously we do a lot of vehicle dynamics work, but nothing with people up to this point. So we partnered with the Peak Performance Lab to generate an assessment battery where we could collect kinetic and kinematic measures that we thought we could derive features from that might be correlates to the performance on pit road. Within a few years, I'm skipping way ahead between these two slides. So there's lots of data collection that happens, but within a few years, we start modeling around these athletes, basically how they move, how that impacts their performance at the racetrack. And a funny thing about NASCAR that we repeat very often is no one grows up playing pit stops in the driveway. So there is no data to look at when you're developing athletes to try to sort of for a competitive advantage. There's no like college or high school stats to look at. So the timeline, it was a large resource drain prior to this point, and the timeline was very long. It would take us about 4 years to develop an athlete from a stick and ball sport to where they were usable in our top level professional series. And we had basically a 1 in 3 chance that at that time they would be sort of an above average performer as we sort of measure it, and it's distributed amongst our competition. After applying these models and putting them in use and in our sort of strategic decision making and applications, we saw that timeline decrease to 1 year and basically had a better than 50-50 chance that our developed athletes would be above average performers. So it was a huge impact, effectively because this is the value of some information versus zero information prior. So another thing that I think we did that was very unique, we did not just simply cluster our athletes based on like movement types. We tried to tie this all the way to the end result, which is effectively their performance metrics. So we wanted to understand not just if this athlete is strong or fast, but how that impacted our pit stop box score. So note, again, just for context, because I know we're kind of the less followed sport in the room, we have a jackman in NASCAR has a 3-point shooting percentage, right? A rear tire changer has a total yards carried for the game. We take a 10-second pit stop, annotate 50 key points, and create 250 math channels, and that is our box score, and this is our target variable. And sort of, again, the inputs were these features derived from movement mechanics and kinetic and kinematic measures. It led, I don't have time to go into the deeper evaluations, but it led to some really interesting advantages when we fundamentally understood how people moved would make them a durable competitor in a certain position. And there were some retraining opportunities where we took the version of a defensive end in NASCAR and turned them into a DB, and it was wildly successful because we fundamentally understood now why and how they were good at these positions. A thing that always comes up when we're talking about going from research into sort of like all the way to application, which I feel like in my work in R&D doesn't happen that often. A part of a major component of this success is the core capabilities that we have internally as an engineering firm. So again, if you're unfamiliar with motorsport, Joe Gibbs Racing is effectively a 500-person engineering company, and over 30% of those that we employ have technical backgrounds in science, math, or engineering. We get to complement that with what we call like a center of excellence. We have an analytics group, but they're not walking around our shop, trying to convince people to use data to drive their decision making. They are developing like core leading edge, like deep rooted capabilities in really advanced engineering, whether that's data management or data enrichment. And that kind of comes about by necessity, this core analytics group that services all these other technical departments out of necessity because our data landscape is so complex. So we bring in GPS and driver inputs into tables that move and increase by 80 million records per event. And our core analytics group is to a place already where these things are getting evaluated in effectively near real time. So we've got this data flowing through models, going to end-use applications, and being delivered to race engineers at the edge within a few minutes and within a few laps. And a core focus right now of our sort of advanced analytics group is getting this to literal real time. So that is part of what allows us to sort of move through this R&D and get to this application. So we're going to measure ourselves up against a yardstick now. So what are the results? So from 2018 to 2021, the chart on your right, you see the number of positions that we net on pit road relative to our competition. So again, I like this chart because it does a good, it sort of captures the sort of zero-sum nature of this game. We gained 562 net positions on pit road over this 4-year span, and our next best competitor gained just over 200. How does that translate to the win-loss column? From this decade that we're looking at right now, from 2013 to 2022, remember our story started in 2014 when we won 2 races. Again, our worst year on record. JGR breaks NASCAR's all-time season win record in 2019 with 19 races, which is over 50% of the scheduled events. So we considered this investment a success. I won't have time, I don't think, to go through this full slide, but this is the not everything works out like it's supposed to. If you remember from my first slide where we talked about generations, we are in the next generation now. This is within NASCAR, we are at the very beginning of Gen 7. So we had to ask ourselves internally, like, did we learn our lesson effectively that was sort of, relentlessly pushing the boundaries forward? Are we going to have another decade like the one we just did? When the rules changed, we had a really interesting sort of consequence that changed the way that our athletes, again, we're sort of focused on pit stops here, mount the wheels to the car. And it was a big enough change that we lost a lot of the sort of skills we had acquired over the last decade, and we were having trouble keeping the wheels on a race car, which, as you can imagine, would be a big problem. We invested a lot of resources into sort of an ML solution because we're not allowed to directly measure the things we would need to sort of give us the confirmation these things are tight per the rules. By time we had a proof of concept that worked, the skill acquisition just through repetition of our athletes had solved the problem, and it was no longer a non-issue, or it was no longer an issue. So we like to sometimes look at this lesson and say 2 things. One, innovative science and technology is not always the answer. Sometimes it's much simpler. And then also there's this sort of, I like to say, as sort of leaders in the technical space within our team or organization, it is our job to remind our owners or decision architects that sometimes the ROI can just be the residual knowledge gained from failure. And those things are very important and help us move forward in a really meaningful way. So what is our next moonshot for the next 10 years? So we founded the Joe Gibbs Human Performance Institute. So in 2021, our models that we had built, basically trying to correlate these movement mechanics features from kinetics and kinematics in these lab-based assessments to our on-field, on-court metrics, basically stopped iterating and giving us a value add year over year. I think what had happened is we had pulled all the value we could from these 2 things that were pretty far apart. So we've got people jumping on force plates, and we're capturing through pose estimation and mocap kinematic data, and we're trying to tie that all the way over here between these 2 dots and this big black box in the middle to a pit stop. So at some point, we recognized that there would be value in more ecologically valid measurement. So can we get these same kinetics and kinematic measures, but can we do it basically in the actions that they are performing so we can much more tightly tie it to our end result so we don't have this big box in between? So we built a biomechanics laboratory that you can drive a race car into. That was a multi-year project and a really big risk. So we have capacity for 120 tri-axis force plates that are subterranean in this building. It's a 2,000 square foot capture area. We're currently using 80 force plates, and we have 40 basically cameras operating at somewhere between 200 and 400 hertz. And we're able to generate the same measures that we were in the laboratory. We're able to measure, basically, get the same sort of laboratory granularity with the actual movements taking place sort of quote unquote on field, on court. Again, we were really focused on this sort of ecologically valid concept. So we went as far as to put our force plates under the ground so that our athletes are running on concrete. So we effectively had to develop a tiled concrete solution, which was, again, an interesting and fun problem to solve. But again, go back to the core concept. If you imagine a baseball game or a NASCAR race happening out in space, we wanted there to be this space shuttle encapsulating this lab, the field of play in such a way that the athletes don't even need to know that all this measurement is taking place. So anyway, after we had protected for driving a car through our laboratory and developing sort of all of these interesting connections with leading edge technology partners and hardware software integrations to make this happen, we basically realized you can kind of do anything in this space. Once you have a biomechanics laboratory you can drive a race car into, there's very few other things you can't do. And so now we've effectively made a big pivot, and we are developing sort of hardware, software, technologies around data acquisition for many different people and partners and sports and movement problems because we've got this unique space. So again, it might be hard to tell, but this basketball court is segmented by force plates. So there is an entire half of the court that is effectively 80 force plates. But again, seamlessly sort of to the athlete that you see in this video, it looks like one solid court. So we have a couple really interesting partnerships. I'll just touch on the top one with NOAA that provides sort of ball physics and shooting metrics to many teams in professional and collegiate basketball. And we are basically integrating sort of the kinetic and kinematic inputs to go along with those outputs to deliver it to their clients. So this leads to, we are already in the next iterative development of our sort of capture environments. We're working on high velocity ball sports where we have netting and turf. And the nice part is each time it just gets easier. Because again, going back to, what's the sort of ROI to Joe Gibbs Racing? As we are pushing through generating all this data for these complex problems across a wide array of sports, our analytics group is generating new core leading edge competencies in data management and enrichment and computer vision and deep learning. And it's just bringing all of these sort of skills, technologies, new people to Joe Gibbs Racing that will be advantageous to us probably in the future in ways that we can't even see yet. So I think that's all I've got. I'm actually a little bit ahead of time, which I'm surprised. So I think I can take some questions. Yeah, thank you for your time and walking through history with me.
Could you walk us through a day of just athlete training and what that looks like for your athletes?
Sure. It's not much different than what you would see in every other sport, although sort of NASCAR isn't as well known. Again, maybe this is my bias. I think it's just as fascinating and interesting. I think it looks a lot like, and this is partly because of our partnerships with people in other sports. There's sort of skill training, right? So there's you would think a basketball court or football field. We do repetition through the actual skills that they need to pit a car. And then there's strength training, and there's treatment, and there's mobility work, and so it's a day in the life of a pit crew athlete is 3 to 4 hours in the morning that's broken up between sort of preventative sort of sports medicine, skill acquisition, and strength and conditioning training, and repeat and rinse. And we race 40 weekends a year, effectively, from about Valentine's Day to Thanksgiving. And so their off season is about 2 months, December and January. But I think I contextualized that well enough. Yeah? Okay.
Hello. I'm sorry. I didn't. I'm wondering how much you guys follow driver weight, or how much that affects the car's performance. I'm thinking back to Danica Patrick had a good run in Indy and NASCAR, and I think she was about 120 pounds.
NASCAR levels the playing field. So there's a minimum weight requirement that includes the driver in the car. So they add weight to make up for the driver's difference in weight. So there's no advantage. Yeah.
Okay, so you don't have drivers that are over the minimum that you would be concerned about?
That we need to ask to lose weight.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like Zion Williamson.
No comment.
I mean, that's always a concern for the Pels. They want him down.
Yeah. Interestingly, there's an intense focus in NASCAR on the center of gravity. So the lower your weight is relative right to the ground is an advantage. So driver shape matters, but overall weight is not impactful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You spoke about the back factory innovations, like how you were measuring the tire gun speeds, and that your competitors were able to really quickly essentially copy that innovation.
Yep.
I'm just wondering why the back factory innovations can't be kept, like we all love it that we can learn about these innovations, but why can't those be more protected in terms of IP?
Yeah.
And also, how much do you think turnover affects these athletes in your field?
Yeah, so I was going to mention sort of churn. So there is sort of a free agency market now in NASCAR where these athletes move across teams. And so although, again, most of these athletes aren't doing the engineering and the development to create sort of these like whatever tech advantages, they fundamentally understand in some way things that have changed, right? And if you're an engineer and you can sit down and interview an athlete that's come from another team and uses an interesting piece of equipment, you might get some really good ideas on where to start. So one, the churn between organizations is one of the reasons. I think two, again, going back to this concept of like having data that your competitors don't, right? If you're trying to derive all of your advantages by basically just doing better analysis on the same data, my personal opinion is you're looking at single-digit percentage gains, right? Because we're all competing against very smart people. So kind of in the same way, not exactly, but like making bits, right? Like that's just not that hard, right? It's the economies of scale that exist in engineering and manufacturing. It's like why we have really cool iPhones and Samsungs, right? Like it's just like, that's much easier. But there aren't just like, again, Patrick Mahomes and Kevin Durant's just popping up everywhere. Also, their salaries sort of show you the supply and demand for that level of, right? So when you invest in the human performance optimization and you basically have a fundamental understanding and you say can acquire a human capital asset, right? That like, those are much harder to they just don't grow on trees, right? So yeah, I wish, I'm an engineer by trade and wish that the things that we developed stayed closer to home for longer, but I think you eventually just sort of like admit that that's not gonna happen and try to find something different to work on. But it's super frustrating, don't get me wrong, when that does happen, yeah.
My question is kind of a following up question for this. So what do these athletes do after retirement? Like, when do they retire and how do you treat these athletes?
Yeah, again, another funny saying that we repeat often is assuming you don't get run over, it's a non-contact sport, so you can do it very long. So our athletes will often come to us, again, from say like minor league baseball or like a practice squad in the NFL, or just elite college level sport. And they're like, you know, just dying to sort of continue that career in the locker room, but like couldn't quite make it in their original sport of choice. And it's like right at the time when like mom is called and said like, you gotta go get a job with Uncle Tom at State Farm. Like it's over, right? Like no more playing basketball in Europe. Like this, it's just like this, we've had enough. That's when our pipeline starts, right? And we're like, hey, NASCAR is a really, we know where we are on the totem pole, but this is a really cool opportunity. We have athletes that can do this for 13, 14, and 15 years. And depending on how good you are, the salaries can be around like league minimums of other professional sports. And so it can be a very viable career and an entire career for athletes that come, again, from these other traditional sports. So, yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more.
Are there psychological aspects of the sport that you can model in your system? Is there such a thing as choking, or if team members come together and clash?
Absolutely, 100%. Like every other sport, totally. The impact of your sort of like good and bad performances, depending on where they happen in game or in race, is wildly different. Also, one thing that we still struggle with, like as we're talking about sort of this research and what are the next steps, your movement mechanics alone, there is an additional variable that is your rate of skill acquisition that I sort of left out of this because we don't understand it well enough. But you can take two athletes with identical sort of characterized movement profiles, and if one is a quote unquote quick learner and the other one is not, one will have a significant advantage over the other. And so we are trying to, and maybe less successfully so, characterize skill acquisition or the rate of skill acquisition. Yeah.
Awesome. I think that's all we had time for. If you
Cool.
give it up for Matt.
Yeah. Thank you.